Hi folks, how are you doing? I hope you are well. This is the week of the tritone. And I think I'm going to make 3 videos, who knows, but this is at least my plan. Tritones are just weird. And so I want to start out by just talking about how we hear tritones as part of a tonal entity, or we hear them as fundamentally disruptive of a tonal entity. And part of the problems with this class is you practice them so much that your mind goes back and forth, and one seems one and the other seems the other. And it gets confusing. And you start thinking that fourths are tritones and vice versa. It's weird. I'll go from there. We'll talk a little bit about some geeky set stuff, about why tritones are special in set theory and what makes them a little bit special. And then we'll try to link this together by starting to talk about the history. And my impression is to make videos short enough. I'm going to divide that up. So the next video will start with more history before I get into talking and singing these two non-ish tonal sets. Although really this one, the 026, is very tonal. The 016 is decidedly non-tonal. And we'll practice with them. Then in the third video, modus novus, 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 and dictation. That's the plan anyway. Stick around. I'll also make a couple practice videos, I think, depending on how things are going. Trying out a new setup so I can give you slightly better audio and we can actually listen to things together on this. So here is our friend, the tritone. And most of the time in the common tonal world, we really hear this as tonal. And this is the first thing I want you to experiment with, is just when you hear this tritone, what does it make you think of? What system of music does it make you think of? Do you hear this resolving? Or do you hear it resolving this way? Even there is a little shift if you think of this as a G7 going to C, or if you think of this as a D flat 7 going to G flat. And notice these are, of course, tritones away because we're switching around the tritones. Which reminds me, talk about jazz. Note to self. Hope you guys are doing good. All right. So what I want to say is that when we first hear them, the most common thing to hear is that one of these is the 7th and the other one is the complementary 3rd or the 7th. That's often how we hear tritones. When we get further on in these videos, we'll start to hear, and it's certainly in modus novus, we'll hear things like this, and we'll hear things like this. In other words, mostly 016s. And these are super hard to hear tonally. You sort of can. Here's this first one, this 016 right here. You can hear this as Lydian because there's a strong 5th, and 5ths are the basis of tonality, so sure, you can hear that. But if you take away the 5th, it sounds distinctly non-jazzy. And we'll talk a lot about that. In other words, these sound non-tonal, although inversions might make some sound more tonal than others. And in the second video, I'll talk a lot more about that. Okay, that's basically the introduction. In other words, do you hear it as part of a 7th chord, or do you hear it floating freely a la Webern or Messiaen or something like that? And let's just do a little bit of geekiness because we love the geekiness. I don't know if you remember, way back at the beginning of the semester, I drew, I think it was a 6th on the board. And then I tried to add every other possible note to see what 3-note cells we could make. In other words, here I'm going to add a half step above. Ooh, what is that? That is a half step and a 4th and a tritone. That's an 016. Now I'm going to add a whole step above this note. That is a whole step, major 3rd, tritone, also known as an 026. We'll talk about these things. Don't worry, I'll slow down. This is just me being geeky. You can add one right in the middle. I mean, yes, you can call this an 036, but can we please just call this diminished, please? And then notice as you get up to here, it's filling in again. So this is really going down an 026. Therefore, this is an 1/6. And the cool thing about tritones is that there are a very limited number of 3-note cells. In fact, there are only 3. That's this. You can have what we've been calling the less tonal construct, the slightly more tonal construct, and the diminished construct. And that's it. So a lot of the confusion of tritones is knowing which one of these you're invoking. And if you're writing a piece of music, does this sound stable or does this sound dissonant? And the same question for there and same question for there. Notice that this is very different. Let me give you just a little tiny bit of like goofy theory. I've tracked down thirds here. This there's something interesting about thirds where if I do the same thing and I'm briefly going to add all these little red notes here, in between a major third, this is known as a major minor. This is known as 3 blind mice. I mean, call it an 024, but ooh, here's another major minor. But look at this. You can start to add things on the outer side. And, you know, we've given names to all of these things. You can add this. Oh, look, here's our 026. You can add this. Oh, here's a major triad if you're reversing it a minor. And you could even do one more, which is an augmented. So if we get rid of the duplicate major minor, there's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sounds, 6 different 3-note cells that you can have with a major third. But when you start adding notes on the outside of a tritone, look what happens. This CBF is still a half step and a fourth or a fifth and a tritone. It's still an 016. If you add the C sharp, it's still an 026. If you add the D, it's back to diminished. There really are only 3 sounds that you can make with 3-note cells when one of them is a tritone. I mean, this is terribly geeky, and I'm going to try to use this to our advantage. And we're, in fact, going to split these apart in the last video. We're going to practice this. We're going to practice this. And yes, we'll even practice some funny aspects of diminished chords. Another way of saying this is just, of course, that if you have an octave, the tritone is right in the middle. So both halves look the same. And whatever you add here, adding here will do the same thing. But if you, assuming you think that octaves exist, which is a whole nother can of worms, if the major third is somewhere around here, adding things here is just different from adding here. So you have more opportunities of mixed sounds when you start with a major third. Okay, is that too geeky? I don't know. Probably, you can probably forget it. Who knows? Maybe you already have. Do let me know. Anyway, so the different levels of hearing, and let's review all of these things with the tritone as I hurriedly erase my iPad. I think I'm going to leave that little bit of graffiti up there. It's like confetti. It's a confetti cake. If you don't know what that is, you're lucky. Okay, so let's talk about it and let's play some things. In fact, let's just to get started. Here's an 016, and here is an 026. Let's do a different inversion. Here's an 016, and here is an 026. We've talked about these before, but I really want to review them and sort of what they sound like. And then the only other option. Ooh, I'm going to draw a double flat. He drew a double flat! Excuse me. Is the diminished. And check it out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play just the tritone. And this is an exercise I want you to do, and maybe pause the video and do some more of it. I'm going to play the tritone, and you supply the missing note. You ready? Here's the tritone. Try to sing a half step up from the lower note. And by the way, there's a whole funny thing called the tritone paradox, which I'll talk about at some point. Okay? Sing the half step above the lower note. Can you sing it here? Can you hear the thirdlessness of that? That's what I think makes this fundamentally non-tonally sounding and what really places it historically in a time when what we like to refer to as tonally functional major and minor triads are prevalent. This is thirdless. There's not a single third here. And hey, try it here too. Let's sing a half step below the top one. Try it yourself. Here it is. It sounds a little jazzy, but there's no third. Now, Let's do the same thing. I'm going to switch to this tritone here. I'm just playing the outer triad. Let's make 2 different O2/6s out of this. Ready? How are we going to do that? Well, sing a whole step up from the bottom. Here's the bottom. You go ahead and sing it. Here it is. And can you hear? Try to pay attention as you do this. Your mind really flips into tonality mode because suddenly there's a major third and suddenly it is a dominant 7 chord. And now just do this other one here. It's going to be slightly different. Here's the top note. Sing down a whole step. La. It sounds kind of restless. It's the upper part of a half diminished chord. It's a Lydian chord, Maria, but it's still much easier to see this in a tonal world than this. It's a cool exercise. Also note, there's all sorts of geeky exercises. Since we talked about the symmetry of tritones and outside is the same as inside, you can also add this note to the tritone, and you can add this note, and they'll also be O2/6s. Let's try that. I mean, come on. What else are you going to do? Sing a whole step above here on the top note. Right here. La. Can you hear that that's also an O2/6? And remember, another part of O2/6s is that they sound like whole tone collections because they are. Everything is in the whole tone scale. Now let's sing the D flat below it. La. There's our O2/6s. Because this is so symmetrical and because this is possible, this is possible, this is possible, this is possible. Hey, look, that's the whole tone scale. Whee! This is the genesis of why you make mistakes when you try to sing sight read stuff like this and you end up singing something like this. These are both O2/6s. This is a great mistake to make when you think you're sight reading this. And it's because of this phenomenon of the symmetry of tritones and the fact that really these are the same set. These are both O2/6s. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's more for the second video. Hey, let's go on. What I want to do now is just listen to some music, talk about it as we go, and see if you can take a little bit of informal dictation, which is just to say, tell me what's going on with the tritones. And I've made a Spotify list, and I'll link to it in this video, so you can follow along. You might not be able to hear this very clearly on this video, but let's start. And in fact, having done so many tritones, take a listen to this. Can you hear that? Why am I starting with this? This is on the playlist. It's Ave Maria from a Mass by Josquin. I think one of the Missa l'Armée. Although, I could be completely wrong. But listen to it for a second. Do you notice a lack of tritones? And this is kind of important because just as you can notice something like this, when you play stuff like this, and even if you add this note, there are no thirds here. And similarly, when you have really sort of strange constructions that might sound just a little bit foreign, there are no half steps here. Similarly, it's really weird. One of these things that defines how we hear, if you want to get fancy and draw those interval vectors, you can, but just think about it. This one that we just drew here, or just imagine a set with no thirds, then imagine a set, and by a set, come on, too academic, a sound world with no half steps. And now imagine a world with no tritones. And basically that's Renaissance music, high Renaissance music, and early medieval music. In early medieval music, which is, I don't know, music written before 10 in the morning. These are the jokes. crazy. They had all these ways. Whoops, they had no clefs. Hey, 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 no clefs. Look, that's a medieval clef. They would do things like write pitches like this, and then they would puzzle, because if you're being diatonic, you got to be really careful of where tritones might exist. So, oh, look, I seem to have written a tenor clef. So, basically, you wouldn't be able to do this, because this isn't a modern clef. You wouldn't be able to go F to B. And in fact, it just wouldn't compute. And what they would do instead is change one of the pitches automatically. And this is called musica ficta. In other words, there is such an aversion to tritones because they disrupted the normalcy of modal thinking. And in fact, very early on, earlier than people think, it was called the devil in music, because it disrupts a sense of having a home. In other words, most medieval modes have a very clear final, and then some of them even have a very clear subfinal. And anytime you have something that might be sort of tritone-like, it goes like, whoa, dude, that's disruptive. So when you listen to something later in the High Renaissance like this, here's the Josquin again. It's a tritoneless world, and that's really interesting. Gradually in the Renaissance, people did slip tritones in, and you can hear them, especially if you listen to some of the Spanish Renaissance music. But they're always on weak beats. They're always passing, unless you feel extremely passionate. What happened, and sorry, this is not a complete music history, but I do want you to hear the difference. That's High Renaissance. That's Josquin. If you listen to this guy, Thomas Victoria, and maybe I'll put a link up. I don't want to play it right now. You'll hear a couple tritones, and it just sounds spicier. And that's one reason it sounds spicier, is there are, in fact, tritones. But let's go to Bach for a second, just because, fast forward a couple hundred years, and here we are, full on tonality. Check it out. And listen to the orchestra. Not just tritones, but, augmented sixths, everything in about a diminished triad. And I mean, this is about how we have to go through suffering in this world. It's just our lot. That's the title of this cantata. I think that's cantata 146, but ask Alan Vogel. He knows these things. I do not. What's interesting about that is Bach is using the fact that tritones sound weird in tonality. And you do see tritones all the time. And whereas you couldn't ever leap them in medieval music, it is perfectly fine to do this in Bach. How can I justify this one? Look, I don't know. There. This tritone is completely fine in tonality because we hear a chord throughout the whole thing. There's a tonal field, and it's perfectly fine to zip back and forth between notes within this tonal field that Bach is describing. And if the tonal field contains a diminished chord like this that you just heard in that last piece, this tritone outline is just fine. In fact, we understand it as something that must be resolved. So dominant sevenths, the really cool thing about it is it's sort of a reply to the medieval and the High Renaissance of, oh, I want to be out of the mode because that will help me return to the mode. And that is a description of tonality itself. So tritones are really part of tonality because you go 1 to a 5 and down to a 1. And the tritone of this 5 chord, whatever key you're in, if you're in F major, the tritone here really drives you back to the tonic in that sense. So the tritones are a necessary part of tonality, and this is how we hear tritones. I'm taking a lot of time on sort of basic philosophical theory because, again, when you do chapter 5 of Modus Novus, it's very easy to get confused about how are you hearing tritones. And I want you to be able to turn your tonal switch on or off, which is why I'm spending time saying things you probably already know, but like a lot of things in music theory, it's really fun to go over things you already know and re-examine them. Isn't it fun? Oh, yes, it is. And since tritones are dramatic, here's a famous tritone that you might not have paid attention to before. See if you can spot where the tritone is in here. You might not notice it in this very famous pathetic sonata. Okay, pathétique, whatever. Check it out again. In other words, the bass goes C, E flat D, C, F sharp, G is a sort of Maria thing. But this was still pretty radical to leap to the 7 of 5 up here. I mean, it's not unheard of, but it's just drama. It's much more dramatic than going, oh, hello, I'm coming up. Oh, here's a passing. Oh, look, here's a 4, here's a 5 of 5. It just doesn't have the same drama as just going, hello, it's a 7 of 5. And it tells you right away that this piece is going to be very dramatic. And the funny thing is in music history, as well as a lot of other kinds of culture, once one thing is dramatic, it stops being dramatic after a while if you repeat it after a while. So once Beethoven does that, or once Bach does his cantata, by the time you get into the mid or late 1800s, tritones aren't so dramatic anymore, and they seem tame. Listen to the beginning of this Liszt sonata for a second. Check out all the tritones. It's like he's trying harder. Do you notice? This, by the way, is called the Dante Sonata. Because, you get it? Dante's Inferno, where this guy goes down to hell, where the devil is. Here's more tritones. He has to do like 4 or 5 of them to achieve the same level of drama as Beethoven does. Next on the list, I do want you to hear what the Russians were doing. And this is a little bit before Debussy. It's pretty cool. There's this guy, Mus Orgsky. Okay, maybe that's not how you spell his name. But he wrote an opera called Boris Godunov. And there's a famous coronation scene where the Tsar is getting crowned, and you hear the church bells, and there's like ringing church bells, ringing church bells, ringing church bells, ringing church bells. And Mussorgsky had to make a decision. How am I going to orchestrate church bells? Because bells are boring, and I have a full orchestra to accompany this. What is the orchestra going to play? And check it out and see if you can hear the choice he made and why he made the choice. This is the beginning of the coronation scene from Boris Godunov. And this is all in that Spotify playlist, so you can stop and pause and play along. Check this out. So see if you can sing the root of that chord, and then sing the root of this chord. La, 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 la. Sing along. So you do it now. Okay, now I'll do it once. La, 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 la. Now you do it. And now just sing the roots. La, la. Hear the tritone? It's just 2 major chords, a tritone apart. It's amazing. I mean, this is essentially the whole piece to accompany the bells. And then, of course, because he's Russian, and really, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Guess what he does after the bells themselves ring out? He's like, I think, I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm just going to repeat the same chords. Ha ha! Good. And then it goes on. In other words, the tritones here are fulfilling a very, very different purpose than they did in the Bach and the Beethoven and the Liszt. And they're here to say this isn't the Renaissance music anymore. What they're doing is they're just an alternation between one chord and another without a tonal reference. And I think that's terribly important because I want you to do a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that last scene if it was an A flat and a D flat chord. So la 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 la. Whoa, whoa, so wrong to go, A flat la 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 la. You can't always get what you want. It's really, it's so tonal. Mussorgsky finds the tritone as this set of changes right here that divorce it from tonality and just let the bells ring out, seemingly in both directions. And suddenly the music is less directional. Okay, I think this video is getting a little long, so I'm going to continue with the history in the tritones part 2. That's it for now. Please do email me with any questions. Practice, have fun, and stay well.